Welcome to Philosophy at Queen's. I'm Dr. Tom Walker, I'm the head of philosophy, and I'm just going to go through a little bit about what's so great about doing philosophy here at Queen's. I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the institution itself. So why come to Queen's? Queen's is one of the Russell Group of universities. That means it's research intensive, and that matters when it comes to do your course, because everyone who's going to be teaching you, if you come to do philosophy here, is a researcher who's doing world-leading research on the subject. And that particularly matters in the final year, where what you find is that you're getting taught the topics that we're researching on. So I research on practical philosophy. If you come and you do my third year module, what you get is what I'm working on, which at the moment is mostly to do with healthcare resource allocation. So that's the kind of topic that you get. Queen's is also very good at placing its graduates into jobs after they finish. I'm going to say a little bit more about that towards the end of this presentation when we look specifically at what philosophy degrees prepare you for. But I think it's an important consideration in deciding where to go is what happens after your time at university. Another thing that matters when you're deciding where to go is what are the facilities like? And Queen's has spent a lot of money over the last decade increasing and improving the facilities that we have, and that's an ongoing process of investment. Of these buildings, the one as a philosophy student you're most likely to engage with is the one in the bottom left-hand corner, the Maclay Library. That provides the source for all the books, the journal articles, and many of those are now available electronically too, so you can access them not only in the library, but also online, on your laptop, or even on your phone, and that makes it much easier for us, for you, to access the resources and make use of them in your studies. Before I get into what philosophy at Queen's is like, I want to say a little bit about what philosophy is. Some of you will have studied philosophy before, but many of you won't. And so I think it's important to see just exactly what we do and how that links into what makes philosophy at Queen's such a good program, such a good place to come. And as I said earlier, I'm going to end up with a little bit about what our philosophy graduates do next, what the philosophy degree here prepares you for. So to start with that question about what is philosophy, one way of thinking about that is philosophy looks at the questions which underlie the questions that all the other disciplines are concerned with. So for example, psychologists will look at how the mind operates, but philosophers ask, well, what is a mind? How do we know which things have minds? Can a computer be conscious? People are trying to build conscious computers and conscious machines, but before we can do that, we need to know what it is to be conscious, and that's what the philosophers will focus on. The other thing that philosophers do when they're looking at these fundamental questions is they ask about things which everyone thinks they know, but when you try and pin it down, you find you don't really know that much about it. So, for example, philosophers ask, what is time? Everyone thinks they know what time is. We're all used to it. We can all tell the time. But what is time? Is it something that flows? It's a metaphor we use a lot. Or is it that we move through time and time stays still? Once you start to really think about it, you'll find that you don't really know what time is. So you don't really know what knowledge is. These are things which we use in our everyday lives, but the philosopher wants to know what it is exactly. Let's try and pin it down. Let's try and make better sense of it. So philosophers ask those questions which are underneath what the other subjects study, but also the questions about all the ideas that we use in our everyday lives, but not entirely sure exactly what they are. Another way of thinking about philosophy is to think about it in terms of not just the questions it asks, but the methods that it uses when dealing with them. So philosophers ask a lot of questions, and in some ways they're better asking questions than they are answering questions, because every answer just generates a whole load of new questions. Philosophers are also a bit skeptical. They recognize that other people have had some really good ideas, really good thoughts about all the topics they're interested in, but they also recognize that those people have made mistakes. So they want to know which of those people's ideas are the right ones, which are the mistakes. And that requires thinking it through for ourselves. So philosophers never take anything on trust when they're doing philosophy. What they do is they say, okay, what have you said about it? That's really interesting, that's really important, but are you right about it? And they ask that question of everybody and of everything. So philosophers can be a bit annoying to other people sometimes because we're never satisfied with the first answer. We want to know, why do you think it? And if you do a philosophy degree, certainly if you do a philosophy degree at Queen's, that's what we get you doing right from the start. So you'll start in the first semester with a question like, what is time? Which we'll ask you. And then we'll quiz you and push you on the answers to try and figure out exactly where you're coming from and how that relates to the views of the other people within the class. So philosophy then is also about asking those questions, but also about asking them in a particular way, a way which tries to work things out and be confident that we're right about things. Philosophy starts with a certain skepticism. How can I tell that what I think is right? How can I tell what these other people are saying is right? Well, let's look at the evidence and the reasons that we have to think that, and then follow that path through. So philosophers ask a lot of questions, and they try and get to what's really at the heart of the problem before we try to answer them. That all sounds a bit theoretical. It all sounds a bit abstract. Well, here, I think I want to draw that into the world of everyday news, everyday ways in which we ask questions and we think about things, particularly in the public sphere. So here are some examples of the kind of questions which come up again and again, but which are questions which are really philosophy questions. Questions about evidence. How do we distinguish what's good evidence for some claim from what's bad evidence? How do we distinguish true facts from fake facts? How do we figure that out? Now, philosophy is not that bothered about particular examples necessarily. We want to know the method for doing that. And once we've got a good method for doing it, then we can use it in every case. And that's what we are going to be looking for. You find a lot of people refer to the science. Let's follow the science. That's the kind of thing that politicians say these days. But what makes something science rather than non-science? Why does that matter? What is so special about science, we might say? Well, philosophers of science have spent a lot of time working on what makes something science rather than non-science, what the scientific method is, and why that matters, why it's a good way of finding out certain things about the world. And that's all part of philosophy. These questions about evidence are really part of what we call epistemology, which is the study of evidence and knowledge. But philosophers also ask a lot about values. So they ask about fairness. If we have a pandemic, not enough ventilators to go around, who should get them? What's a fair way of making those decisions? If we get a new vaccine, not everyone can get it straight away. So who should have priority? Why should they have priority? What counts as a fair allocation system? Again, those are all questions that philosophy deals with. And the third example I've got here is one about balancing different values that we have. We have a right to privacy, it seems, but we also have values about protecting public health and national security, and they sometimes come into conflict. If we have a COVID tracing app on our phones, what information from that is shared, and is that acceptable as a way of protecting the public health? Our privacy matters, but so does health. How do we balance our privacy against national security needs? Those questions of balancing different values are yet again a case in which philosophers work on. So when you come up, the government, for example, comes up with policies on these, they're often pulling on philosophers and the work of philosophers in making those decisions. So even though philosophy is a very abstract kind of subject, and I said at the start, we look at the questions that are underneath the questions, the answers to those questions are very important in engaging in lots of different areas of public debate. So here's a kind of graphical representation of how that all looks in practice. In the middle, we have the really basic theoretical questions, questions about knowledge. How do we know things? How do we distinguish the truth from the falsity? That's epistemology. We have the basic question about what exists in the world. Does time exist? Do minds exist? What exists? That's the questions of metaphysics. And if you start here. That's the kind of questions we start you with in the first semester. First year. What is knowledge? What exists? Logic is then a tool to help us to think more clearly, and that's also in the core. And then we move out to some things which are a little bit more specific. Moral philosophy, all about the values and what's important. How do we know what's right and wrong? What makes something right or wrong? Questions about the mind. Does consciousness exist? What is it? How do we tell which things have it? Can we build a machine that has it? And then as we move even further out, we get much more specific questions about the philosophy of pretty much anything. And you can have a philosophy of anything because the philosophers ask the underlying questions. What are the assumptions this discipline makes or this subject makes? What is it that's really important? How do they understand? How should we understand the ideas that are embedded within it? So we can see a kind of really theoretical core, and as we go further out, we get to the more practical, more applied kind of questions. And that's something that in the degree here, we move through. So you start somewhere in the middle bit, in that grey and the dark red area, and by the time you get to third year, we're out in those kind of the light red circle, as we take the fundamental ideas and apply them more and more to real world problems. If that's what philosophy is, why study philosophy at Queen's? Well, I think the thing here is to focus on the research expertise. As I said right at the start, you get taught by world-leading researchers in all the modules here. So our expertise covers three main areas. And those areas are the ones that we've been looking at when we look at the practical questions that philosophy asks and how philosophy is engaged in everyday debate. Some of those are about epistemology and philosophy of science, what makes something scientific, what counts as good evidence, what is things that we know, how do we know that we know them, how do we distinguish true facts from fake facts. Those are the areas of epistemology and philosophy of science, and they're one of the areas where we have a particular research strength here at Queen's. The second main strength we have is in questions about value, questions about ethics, questions about political philosophy. Those questions include ones about when is forgiveness appropriate, when should you forgive, but also questions about things like civil disobedience and free speech. We work on questions to do with both the interpersonal relations, so I work on consent, for example, questions about what consent is, how it works, what's required for someone to actually have consented in that two-person case, to questions about global justice and fairness around the world. And the third area where we have particular expertise here at Queen's are questions to do with philosophy of religion. Questions about God, but not in the way that theologists would deal with God. And one of those issues is very much concerned with the full knowledge of God. If God knows what we're going to do, that means we can't do anything else. And how does that square with us being responsible for what we do? Generally, we think people are only responsible if they could have avoided acting in the way that they did. But divine foreknowledge seems to mean that that's not possible. So how do we deal with that free will question? Do we have free will? And what are the implications for that about who's blameworthy for what? That's the third area of expertise. We've got these kind of three main areas of expertise. One's about knowledge and science, one about values, both interpersonal and political across societies, and one about theology, about God. And all of our courses are related to those areas of expertise. And as I said earlier, those are the areas which lead into and underpin much of the questions that we deal with in our everyday life outside of the philosophy classroom. So I'm just going to give a little example of how this works in practice and how we might do it. This is an example from my second year class, just to see how it works. So what we've got here is a little story. We've got two little stories. And I'll show you how philosophers would engage with this. So in the top right-hand corner, we've got a trolley. That's the train running down the track. The brakes have failed. And if it keeps going down that track, there are 5 people tied to the track and they're all going to die. But you, standing beside the track, have got a switch. You can switch the trolley onto the side track If it does that, the 5 people survive, but unfortunately the one person tied to that track will be run over and die. What should you do? The ethicist says. Well, if we were in a face-to-face meeting, I would ask you to give me the answer, but I can be pretty sure what you're going to say. 90% of people will say you should switch the trolley onto the side track. Save the 5, even if we have to sacrifice the 1. That sounds pretty plausible. And then we give you another story in the bottom left-hand corner here. Same trolley, no side track. Same 5 people tied to that track. This time, the only way to stop the trolley hitting the 5 people is to push a man in front of it. There you are on the bridge. In front of you is a very large man. You can push him in front of the trolley. It will slow the trolley down. He unfortunately will die, but the 5 people will be saved. What should you do, we say? Most people are going to say you can't push a man in front of a trolley. That's always wrong. That's the right answer. But now the philosopher says, we've got 2 examples here. They give you, in both cases, we've got, do we sacrifice 1 person to save 5? And you've given us different answers. In the first case, yes, you said. In the second case, definitely not. What's the difference between those 2 cases, and why does that matter? This is kind of the method that we would use in teaching philosophy. We have a lot of these little stories, get your intuitions, and then say, but you just said something completely different over there. Now let's try and figure out what the difference is. Now this might look like a fanciful story, but this trolley kind of problems were first developed by Philippa Foot in dealing with a very practical question about ethics, which was a question about the permissibility of abortion. Take the heat out of the subject by moving to a different kind of example, figure out what's really going on, and then apply it back to that really important practical question. That's just to give you a little hint about how we do things and how we might teach our modules here. So what are our programs? If you come to do philosophy at Queen's, you can either do it as a single honours program, which is just philosophy, you do philosophy all the way through. We can do it with one of 4 other subjects in a joint honours program. You do philosophy with either anthropology, English, history, or politics. And in those cases, what you're doing is spending half the time doing philosophy and half the time doing the other subject. And then we have a politics, philosophy, and economics program, which combines 3 subjects. I'm not going to say less about that because it's going to be covered by the politics people. I would say a bit more, though, about the single honours program, just to give you a sense of what we do and how it works. As you'll see, in the first year, what you do is you take 4 philosophy modules and 2 from somewhere else within the university. They deal with those foundational questions about logic, about metaphysics, about epistemology, about values. Then in the second year, we have a set sequence of modules. Everyone does the same ones. That's important, I think, and it adds a particular value to the course. One of the things that comes about coming to university is it's a big place, thousands of students. But the way we set the course up here, you work with the same people basically throughout your first and second year. You get comfortable with them. It's important in philosophy that you talk to each other, you discuss, you argue, and it's much easier to do that if these are the people that you know and you come comfortable with. You get a real sense of this is our cohort, we're working through it together. And I think that cooperative element is very important within a subject like philosophy. And in the final year, you get a choice about what you want to do, depending on what you find most interesting and enjoyable in the earlier years. Everyone does a dissertation, and that's a question where you come up with, here's the thing in philosophy that I really want to know the answer to. So some of those questions are very abstract, some are very practical. I'll give you some examples. So last year I was supervising 4 dissertations, and one of them was on ancient Stoicism, very theoretical kind of question. One of them was on Friedrich Nietzsche's account of the genealogy of morals, another very theoretical question. But the other 2 were very practical. One was on the ethics of horse racing, and one was on the ethical acceptability of sex robots. Quite a wide range there. You get to choose what you want to work on. The joint honours program, all the modules are the same, but you only do half of them because you're doing half of philosophy and half of the other subject, whatever that other subject is. There's no limitations here. We don't say only the single honours students can do this module. Anyone can do it. Whichever course pathway you're on, you get to choose which ones you want to do. That's what the course is like. That's the kind of topic that we cover. But what happens to our students after they leave Queen's? Where do they go on to do next? Well, I've got 3 examples here to show you the range of different things that people who've studied philosophy go on to do. On the left, Asia left here. She did some work in the voluntary sector to start with, a different NGO, and now she's gone on to do further study at Cambridge. In the middle, we have Stephen Agnew, who did philosophy here and has gone on to work in the public sector, and on the right, Fergal McFerrin, who went on to work in the private sector. So we've got here is the range of options we have. Further study, work in the public sector, work in the private sector. And I think that gives an idea of the range of different pathways that are open for those who study philosophy and who work on philosophy during their degree here at Queen's. And the reason for that is that philosophy develops a set of skills which are in demand across different subject areas and different businesses and different sectors of the economy. 2 of those, I think, are particularly important. One is philosophy is about creative problem solving. We take really hard questions and say, how do we solve this problem? We go into what the underlying issues are, what's really going on in this debate. And then we assess what the right answers are. And then we put all that together in a way which presents those results to someone else so they can see clearly what it is we're talking about. That kind of creative problem solving is a feature of our degree pathway. I'll give you an example. So in the 3rd year module on practical philosophy, we give you a particular problem. One example that we used last year was about allocating scarce healthcare resources. You get given the problem, you've got to come up with a policy. How are we going to do that? And then we use the philosophy that you've been learning to get into what a fair way of doing that is, and explaining that and arguing it out with each other to get the right answer. And then present that as a report at the end as the assessment for the module. The other thing, the skill that what we develop within the philosophy degree pathway is dealing with the concerns of ordinary life in a way which is sensitive to the variety of opinions and practices and ways of life that people have. Philosophy asks a lot of questions. But it does so in a way which is sensitive, in a way which is appreciative that everyone has something to contribute and everybody's views have got something good in them. There's also, I said philosophers are often skeptical. We recognize that people make mistakes, but part of that is being very recognizing that we make mistakes. And other people have got a lot to teach us, as well as we've got a lot to teach them. So that willingness to engage with a wide range of views is something else that philosophy, of course, develops. And those skills, creative problem solving, dealing with practical problems in a way which is sensitive to the opinions and practices of others, are the kind of skills which employers across a whole range of sectors find very valuable. And because of that, people who do philosophy end up going into lots of different kinds of subjects, different kinds of careers. They go into the public sector. They go in things like the civil service, the government, teaching. They go into the private sector, sales, investment, management consultancy, accounting. They go into the NGO sector. The philosophy doesn't prepare you specifically for one pathway. What I'm saying here, I guess, is that philosophy prepares you for lots of different pathways. And that's great if you don't know at the moment what you want to do. What we do is we prepare you for anything. And from that, so you don't have to decide and before you start. You can decide after you finish. That's the other thing I'm going to say here. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions about the philosophy program or what we do, please just drop me a line. My email address is here, tom.walker@qub.ac.uk, and I'll get back to you in response. Thank you.